Okay, so welcome to part 2 of this workshop on Lawrence Hill's The Book of Negroes. And I just wanted to continue with the thread of thinking about what a migrant identity as opposed to a kind of exiled identity might look like. And here I'm turning to a discussion that was had between a number of Haitian American writers, including Edwidge Danticat. And she says, quote, "Home is not a place anymore, but an idea, an attitude, an ideal." And also her homeland, she suggests, is a floating homeland, an ideological one. And her position is between worlds, both inside and outside. So we can see here that there's a much more kind of sense of fluidity to the migrant identity. Home doesn't become a kind of physical location, but becomes an idea and an ideal. And homeland kind of remains floating. And there's a sense of liminality here. So betweenness, in between inside and outside. And there can be a benefit to that sense of in-betweenness. So similarly, going back to the idea of roots and roots as in a kind of global sense of rootedness, another theorist called Delofre has said, in contradistinction to Western models of passive and empty space, such as terra and aqua nihilus, which were used to justify territorial expansion, so that is ideas of land and water, and as kind of an idea of ownership of those different forms of land, particularly. His idea, which is called tidialectics, foregrounds alternative models of reckoning space and time that require an active and participatory engagement with the island seascape. Attention to movement offers a paradigm of rooted roots, of a mobile, flexible, and voyaging subject who is not physically or culturally circumscribed by the terrestrial boundaries of island space. So understanding kind of global movement as a form of island movement, and this idea of tidialectics, which gives a paradigm of rooted roots. So we're kind of moving beyond even then the idea of the rhizome here for an idea of rooted roots. So every route that you take within this network kind of is mobile, flexible, and voyaging. And so you're not bounded by kind of territorialized ideas of space, particularly. And this is also a similar concept to one that is considered by Paul Gilroy, and again, coming back to his work, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. So he says, "I have settled on the image of the ships in motion across the spaces between Europe, America, Africa, and the Caribbean as my starting point. The image of the ship is a living, microcultural, micro-political system in motion. Ships immediately focus our attention on the Middle Passage, on the various projects for redemptive return to an African homeland, on the circulation of ideas and activists, as well as the moment of key cultural and political artifacts." So again, we have an image here of the ship being one that's mobile, but one that's also interestingly multicultural. So even if you think about the slave ship, it's a kind of micro-political system, but it's also mobile, and it's moving between these different kind of nation states. So that is the kind of image of mobility that Paul Gilroy is interested in this book, The Black Atlantic. And if you think about the role that the ships play in the Book of Negroes, they're really significant. We kind of begin with the really extreme violence and trauma of the slave ship, but as Aminata moves and kind of voyages across the globe, we have different images of the ship and the ship's ability to move, and the kind of microcosm, micropolitics of what happens on the ship as well. And I think one of the things that is useful here with the idea of migrant identity and the kind of fluidity of dialectics is this idea of flux. So flux is a flow or flowing of liquid, a flowing in of the tide, a continuing movement, especially in large numbers of things, constant or frequent change or fluctuation. So as opposed to an idea of identity that you could imagine, which is rooted and fixed in the earth, in a particular form of territorialized land or nation land, dialectics and that form of kind of migrant identity brings with it this idea of flux and fluctuation and mobility, which kind of almost lifts the kind of restrictions of an idea of rootedness that can be really problematic. So if we think about, for example, the Caribbean, and we know about the proliferation of slavery within the Caribbean. Haiti in the middle here was the only Caribbean, well, the only location globally where there was a successful slave revolt. Interesting that it's right in the middle of the Caribbean. But if we think about this idea of dialectics and an idea of kind of fluid identity, then the kind of movement around and through the Caribbean kind of provides a mapping of that understanding of identity, I think. And this is just some kind of basic kind of background on Canada specifically. So this is much more kind of later forms of the Immigration Act in 1967. You had the 1971 multiculturalism policy, 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the 1988 Multiculturalism Act. So these are kind of the legal parameters for multiculturalism in Canada. Okay, I wanted to touch on also the literary form of the novel. So you may have read some slave narratives previously to this. So we can think here about figures like Frederick Douglass or like Harriet Jacobs, who in the 19th century kind of real life examples of slaves who managed to either escape or were given freedom. And then later on in life, they wrote their kind of autobiographies, which became known as the form of slave narrative. And these were really instrumental in abolitionist movements to end slavery, and they were utilized kind of across the United States and Canada, but also in the United Kingdom to kind of spread awareness of what was really going on with slavery. So clearly Lawrence Hill is engaging in that literary tradition of the slave narrative with his story of Aminata. So we have a very similar kind of narrative here. So for example, we have, we follow Aminata's whole life, which is slightly different to the slave narrative, but these are the kind of main points of similarity. So we have the form of kind of enlightenment. So Aminata learning to read and being able to have that kind of sense of herself and her own position. Very similar to other female slave narratives, she has her children stolen from her, taken away, and sold into slavery. We also have moments of resistance in the novel where Aminata stands up to her white slave owner. And those moments of resistance are really crucial in slave narratives. We also have the idea that Aminata is telling her story, retelling her story. But I think crucial to this text in particular is the idea that this is a kind of ghost story that we get from Aminata. And Chariandu, who's another Canadian writer, in an interview with Kit Dobson here, talks about this idea of a ghost, kind of almost like a ghost slave narrative, as a means to explore the language and ghosts of precisely such a remote cultural legacy, a particular state of sensing but not really knowing one's origins, and consequently a particular process of exploring one's origins without easy recourse to official meanings or narratives. So we could think about the Book of Negroes as being a kind of ghostly or spectral form of slave narrative. So there's a sense in which Lawrence Hill wants to explore this area of history, but there's also a kind of sense of distancing, of not understanding or not having an easy recourse to official meanings or official senses of that history. So one of the ways that Lawrence Hill kind of negotiates that sense of absence is through using material documentary evidence. So the title of the book, The Book of Negroes, comes from the document that enabled Black people to leave New York and leave on the ships to Nova Scotia, which is a real kind of document. So there's an interesting relationship here between kind of the ghostly and also the materiality of the document, which Lawrence Hill is working through. And we could think about that sense of the document as a form of contact. And this comes from Mary Louise Pratt, Arts of the Contact Zone. And we could think about the forms of contact that we get in the kind of exploration of the globe, in the exchanges that Aminata has when she enters new kind of regions of her different locations. So Louise Pratt argues, we are looking for the pedagogical arts of the contact zone. These we will include, we are sure, exercises in storytelling and identifying with the ideas, interests, histories, and attitudes of others, experiments in transculturation and collaborative work, and in the arts of critique, parody, and comparison, including unseemly comparisons between elite and vernacular cultural forms, the redemption of the oral, ways for people to engage with suppressed aspects of history, including their own histories, ways to move into and out of rhetorics of authenticity, ground rules for communication across lines of difference and hierarchy that go beyond politeness but maintain mutual respect, a systematic approach to the all-important concept of cultural mediation. So cultural mediation being the kind of goal or aim we could think about for the Book of Negroes, and how the text negotiates these different forms of contact. Contact zones is what Mary Louise Pratt calls them. So we could think about Lawrence Hill's novel as a form of pedagogy, a form of teaching. It was a widely read book, so it was going to be kind of, its aim was to teach people about slavery, but also the kind of different forms that it engages with throughout the text. So the idea of storytelling and of oral retelling is really important to it. I like this idea of moving in and out of rhetorics of authenticity. So you have this singular narrative voice of Aminata, but there's also a question mark over kind of how authentic that first person narrative is, given the fact that we know that Lawrence Hill is the writer of the text. So we kind of move into and out of rhetorics of authenticity here. But there's also a kind of interesting movement between the different contacts and exchanges that Aminata has in the novel, and how she kind of is able to articulate herself across different hierarchical forms. So whether she's talking to fellow Black people or whether she's engaging with whites, there's all these different forms of contact in the novel. Okay, so I will leave it there for today, but do think about some of these aspects and perhaps moments in the text where we see some of these kind of different issues and tensions arise.